Order. Would everyone please ensure that all electronic devices are turned off or switched to silent mode? We now continue to line-by-line consideration of the bill. The grouping and selection list for today's sitting is available in the room as well as on the parliamentary website. And I remind members about the rules on declaration of interests as set out in the Code of Conduct. We now come to the question that Clause 37 stand part of the bill. Minister, good morning.
Thank you very much, and pleasure once more to be in this delightful room, doing line-by-line scrutiny of the bill before us. Clause 37 repeals in full the Safety of Rwanda Act, the Act which requires that decision-makers treat Rwanda as a safe third country for the purpose of removing individuals there, and disapplies sections of the Human Rights Act 1998 was passed by the previous government in an attempt to facilitate removals to Rwanda under its Migration and Economic Development Partnership. Despite this, the Safety of Rwanda Act has served no practical purpose since it became law. No decisions were made which were affected by its provisions, and as we have stated repeatedly, only 4 individuals were ever relocated, and that was voluntarily. No enforced removals to Rwanda ever took place under the Migration and Economic Development Partnership. This government's been clear from the outset that we will not be proceeding with the partnership. There is no evidence it was successful in deterring small boat arrivals, nor has it delivered value for money for the British taxpayer. On the contrary, nearly 84,000 people arrived on small boats between the 14th of April 2022, which was the date the Migration and Economic Development Partnership was announced by the former government, and the 5th of July, the day after this government was elected. The government's been clear that we will not be making further payments to Rwanda, saving 100 million in upcoming annual Economic Transformation and Integration Fund payments to Rwanda, and a further 120 million that the UK would otherwise have been liable to pay once 300 individuals had been relocated to Rwanda. This was without considering even the additional staffing and operational costs, which would have been substantial. We will also be exiting the UK-Rwanda Treaty as part of ending the Migration and Economic Development Partnership. It's therefore appropriate for the government to repeal the Safety of Rwanda Act. So this legislation, which relies on the provisions of the treaty, would no longer be on the statute book, and this is what Clause 37 achieves.
Matt Vickers.
Thank you. Clause 37 repeals the Safety of Rwanda, Asylum and Immigration Act 2024. By doing this, the government is removing the only deterrent, and indeed the only place we can send people to who have arrived from a safe third country. It's well established that there are some countries to which it is extremely difficult to return people, added to which lack of documentation can often frustrate the process of removal to someone's home country. That is why a third country deterrent is needed, so that if people cannot be removed to their home country, they can and they will be removed to a third country. The logical consequence of the repeal of the Safety of Rwanda Act is that a greater number of migrants will arrive from harder to remove countries, and without some form of safe country agreement to send these migrants to, they will continue to come and to stay. The National Immigration and Asylum Act 2002 contains a safe list of countries in section 80AA, but this list is limited to those countries who contribute very few illegal immigrants, save Albania. But under the last Conservative government, we cut the number of Albanian illegal migrants coming to the UK by small boat crossings by over 90%, showing our returns agreement with Albania worked. As the former Director General of the Border Force said, if we cannot send them back, we could send them to another safe country, ergo Rwanda, where they could be resettled safely without adding to the continuing flow of arrivals by small boat from France. Channel boat crossings are up 28% since the election, with over 1,300 people crossing in the week commencing the 1st of March 25. This government has smashed farmers, small business owners and pensioners, but it seems that the people smuggling gangs are the only people safe from the Labour government. The only thing that will stop the gangs is a strong deterrent. That means people do not board small boats because they know that they will be deported if they reach the UK and they will not be allowed to stay. The additional offences and powers in this bill are welcome as far as they go, but with the scrapping of the Conservatives' deterrent, that if you have no right to be in this country, you will not be able to stay, this bill is just window dressing. It will not and cannot stop people crossing the channel in small boats. And the government know this, because their own impact assessment shows that only a handful of people each year will be imprisoned because of the new offences created by this bill. And since announcing that our deterrent would be scrapped, there are almost 8,500 more people now in asylum hotels. This is the government's failure. Yeah.
John Hayes.
I was trying to count the number of times in which he used the word deterrent and I ran out of fingers. So could he please define what a deterrent is?
Does he want me to count my fingers as well? Or deterrent? The deterrent is preventing people getting in those boats. If people know that when they arrive in this country they're going to be detained and removed, they will stop coming. I will.
Member for giving way. Does he acknowledge that the crossings rose from 299 in 2018 to 150,000 since, the majority of which were on the Conservatives' watch? And does he also acknowledge that deportations have actually increased by 24% under this government?
Does he know what happened in terms of global migration and the movements around the globe? But then actually, if you compare in the last week, the movements into Europe and the movements into this country seem to be slightly misaligned. Numbers arriving in this country are up 28%. The number of people staying in hotels in communities across this country up 29%, 8,500 more people. The number of people who've arrived in this country illegally and been removed is down significantly since this government came to office. I won't. It's clear a new approach is needed. The National Crime Agency said stopping channel migrants is not possible without a Rwanda-style scheme. It was a terrible mistake for Labour to cancel our deterrent before it had even started. The Labour government like to point out the cost of the Rwanda plan, but a deterrent which stops illegal migrants from making the crossing and settling in the country will save the state billions in lifetime costs. As Carl Williams from the Centre for Policy Studies pointed out, the Office for Budget Responsibilities analysis last summer estimated that a low-skilled migrant, or low-wage migrant, as the OBR puts it, will represent a lifetime net fiscal cost to the taxpayer of around £600,000. Williams also pointed to analysis from Denmark, the Netherlands and other European countries that asylum seekers' lifetime fiscal costs tend to be steeper than that. The evidence therefore suggests that if 35,000 people cross the Channel a year, which is roughly where we were last year, at that sort of cost range, it will probably be 50 billion or 60 billion of lifetime costs. I will.
Tom Hayes.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Member to desist from using that report because in oral evidence I asked two experts whether they thought it was possible to make such assessments and they declined on the basis of available evidence. In fact, the author of that report himself said that the integrity of the available evidence was fairly lacking in robustness. And when I put questions to him about whether he considered certain key counterfactuals, he himself admitted that he had not. And when we later heard from Professor Brian Bell in responding to one of my questions about whether it was appropriate for MPs to be brandishing that sort of research, he basically said it would be foolhardy because the report itself was making very brave assumptions. Will he now desist from using that report, given that we are in a democracy trying to have accountability and truth, and we shouldn't be using fake information?
Interventions must be short.
I apologise.
He won't desist from using those figures, but I'll be very happy to hear his alternative figures when the time comes, because I'm sure it's not cost neutral. I'm sure it's very expensive, however big the cost. That's why an effective removal and deterrent agreement is needed. Can I ask the Minister, are the government looking at a removals and deterrent agreement? How does the Minister think we can control our borders without one? Is it clear that this bill is not going to be effective? Well, it is clear that this bill is not going to be effective in doing so. If not, why they're repealing the only deterrent that the UK has? Does the Minister agree with the National Crime Agency that a removals agreement is the only way to stop channel migrants, as happened in Operation Sovereign Borders in Australia? The government say they are clearing the backlog and returning people who arrived on small boats. This is not just the case. This is just not the case. The most recent immigration figures show the asylum backlog is higher than when Labour came into office, and returns of small boat arrivals are down again in the most recent quarter. Only 4% of small boat arrivals are being removed. In fact, out of the total returns between October and December 2024, only 16% of removals were enforced. In the 3 months before, only 13% of removals were enforced. So can I ask the Minister, does she think that allowing 96% of illegal immigrants who arrive by small boat to stay in the UK is a deterrent? At the moment, yeah.
I promise, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chair, that I will be briefer. Would the honourable member agree with me that on the balance of enforced returns and voluntary returns, the overwhelming trend under the last Conservatives was for voluntary returns? In fact, only 23.9%, in 2023 only 24% were enforced returns, in 22, 25%, in 2021 27%. The trend over the last years has been one of voluntary returns. Would he not agree that that's a trend?
Well, I would say that the big issue here around deterrence is actually how many of those people arriving in small boats are being removed. Despite the fact the number arriving is up 28%, the number being returned, the actual number being returned and removed from this country who arrived illegally, is down significantly. And I think that's the big question at play here.
I thank the honourable member for his patience. Would he agree that he's changing the goalposts slightly in order to manufacture a political argument which he knows, were he to use the evidence available, would not be supported? And would he furthermore look back into history and see the record of the last Labour government? I'll invite him to make comments on the success of the last Labour government. I know he'll want to jump onto that. And in 2004, that we saw 85% of those people reaching our country removed by enforced returns. In 2005, 73%. That actually, where there was a trend of enforced returns, it was under the last Labour government.
I think in terms of political arguments, you know what the people out there want to see? They want to see the number of people arriving in the country illegally going down. They're not seeing that. It's up 28%. They want to see the number of hotels in communities across this country going down. It's not. It was going down. The number of people arriving was going down. It's now up 28%. There are now 8,500 more people in hotels. That's the political argument, or the reality of the situation. Yeah.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's being very generous, but of course that's what committee debates are meant to be about. It's just easier to have a little bit more to and fro in committee than it often is on the floor of the House when you've got 2.5 minutes and you've had to rewrite your speech and discard most of what you were going to say. I wonder if the honourable gentleman would admit that the way that the Illegal Migration Act interacted with the Safety of Rwanda Act meant that nobody could be processed at all, and they were just stuck, and there was just a build-up of small boat arrivals and other people claiming asylum in hotels who couldn't be processed, which meant that there's a big backlog. We've had to restart decision-making, which we're now doing, but that inevitably means there'll be a slowdown in being able to send people who've arrived by small boat back until we can get on top of the backlog that his government created.
Matt Vickers.
The reality is, the principle that is at stake is that if you arrive in this country illegally, you were going to be removed. We weren't processing people who had arrived illegally and were meant to be removed. We were returning more of them, though, before the election than we are now. I'll carry on, I'll get through this, and there'll be plenty of time for debate. I'm sure we've got a full morning ahead of us. Can I ask the Minister, does she think that allowing 96% of illegal migrants who arrived by a small boat to stay in the UK is a deterrent? At the moment, people know that if they come here on a small boat, they are 96% likely to be allowed to stay. That's a strong pull factor. The only way to remove that pull factor is to reinstate a strong deterrent. People need to know that if they arrive here on a small boat, they will not be able to stay. Can the Minister explain how she's going to increase the number of removals without a third country to which migrants can be sent? If not Rwanda, where will they be going? Will it be Redcar? Will it be Romford? Will it be Richmond? Where are these people who cannot be removed to a safe country going to go? As Altma Met said, repealing the Rwanda Act will encourage illegal immigration. Mehmet said 240,000 people were declared to have entered the EU illegally last year and will likely end up coming to the UK. The government have confirmed with this bill and the repeal of the Safety of Rwanda Act that there is no deterrence, because once they arrive here, the likelihood is that they will be able to stay. Mehmet echoed the comments from the National Crime Agency, saying the only deterrent is to restrict arrivals and to contain and remove quickly. That will send the right message. As Mehmet pointed out, there isn't anything in the bill that would suggest people would be removed quickly. So can I ask the Minister why a removals agreement has not been included in this bill? The EU is now looking at offshore processing and deportation centres. There is also a growing consensus in the EU that the 1951 Refugee Convention is not fit for purpose. What assessment has the Minister made of the impact of these changes on the UK? Why has the government scrapped the Rwanda plan, leaving the UK as an outlier? We wish to oppose the repeal by way of a division.
Joe White.
Thank you so much, Chair. I welcome this opportunity to examine a failed Rwanda scheme. The Israeli scheme, set up over a decade ago, provides stark evidence that the previous government should have considered before recycling an idea that has cost taxpayers £700 million. In Israel, asylum seekers were given a stark choice: be sent home, go to a migrant detention facility, or take $3,500 on a one-way flight to Rwanda. One such asylum seeker quickly found that he wasn't welcome on arrival. No sooner had he landed in Kigali, he was told he must leave again for Uganda, and all for a fee. He said that he quickly left for Greece on a small boat, and then travelled overland to Switzerland, where he is now settled. Another used a $5,000 payment he received to catch a flight to Amsterdam, where he then claimed asylum status. The previous Conservative government entered into the agreement with Rwanda with full knowledge of the previous failings in Rwanda and offered individuals a personal payment of £3,000 to resettle their lives. Figures have been bandied about on how many asylum seekers that Rwanda were willing to take, with the previous government saying 1,000 and Rwanda saying between 100 and 200. It's not clear who was right, but the question that has often been repeated to me is how can that be regarded as a deterrent? Indeed, our witnesses from the refugee support organisations made the point that people will continue to come to try their luck, and 84,000 of them took that risk. I welcome that we've got our common sense back and we are repealing the Act, but I despair at the waste of the taxpayers' money spent pursuing a fantasy that had already failed elsewhere.
Thank you. Good morning to you, Mr Stewart, for week 2 of our fascinating sessions into the depths of this bill. Can I just say to the Minister, there will be absolutely no argument from me about this one, and I wholeheartedly agree with her that this bill has to go. And I think when we look back at the whole sorry Rwanda debacle, we'll just simply wonder how on earth such a crackpot scheme was not just conceived, but actually constructed and delivered. There will be a few words that will be forever put on the gravestone of the last Conservative government, and it will be "stop the boats" in Rwanda. And it was the first time in my experience, Mr Stewart, where they just introduced and passed the bill that decreed a new reality. Through sheer willpower alone, the Conservatives declared that Rwanda was a safe place. And in true Orwellian style, they even called it the Safety of Rwanda Bill. It was the most blatant political attempt of ever trying to convince us that black was white. Now, if we look at Rwanda currently, it is so safe that it's currently accused of supporting the M23 militia, which is claimed to be recruiting child soldiers and carrying out killings and rapes of civilians in the DRC. But in saying all of that, Rwanda played an utter blinder. They milked this for all it's worth. They saw these mugs coming. And so far, Rwanda have made £240 million, money that will not have to be paid back. And the bill was described by the Law Society as defective and constitutionally improper, and it was declared unlawful in the Supreme Court. Now, all of these rebukes did nothing for the Conservatives other than encourage them to ensure it became a reality. But you just have to look at the sheer range of the waste and the sheer stupidity that was the very essence of Rwanda. The headline, of course, it cost the taxpayers $750 million and failed to deport a single asylum seeker against their will. There was £270 million to support economic development in Rwanda, £95 million on detention and reception centres, and £280 million on other fixed costs. £50 million was spent preparing for flights that never took off. Then there's the farce of the Kigali Four, the 4 volunteers that were sent to Rwanda, the only people that actually made it through this whole scheme. And Tortoise did us a favour of unearthing the script that was used with the Home Office, trying to persuade people to take up a generous one-time offer of a relocation package to Rwanda. One source said this demonstrated an insane level of resource that went into proving the concept. Now, the Tories were so obsessed with this scheme, it totally blinded them to what was happening in the rest of the immigration landscape, and we've heard an example of that from the Minister. But they were so exclusively focused on Rwanda, spending so much political capital on it, they didn't notice the hundreds of thousands of people who just so happened to come into the UK through a new immigration system that they had put in place and that they didn't fully, properly understand. Even small boat crossings hit record levels in the year that Rwanda policy was announced, and deaths in the Channel have steadily risen in that subsequent period. A deterrent it most definitely was not. Asylum seekers came to the same assumption as every other practical person in the UK knew, that there was no till very little chance of ever being put on a flight to Rwanda. And they tell us that they want to keep it. Instead of defending this policy and trying to bring it back, the Tories should be apologising for this scheme and promising to never come up with something as harebrained again. But after listening to the leader of the Conservative parties over the weekend about stopping human rights for asylum seekers, I don't think they've really learned their lesson on that one. But they should be asking for forgiveness for trying to forcibly remove refugees to a third country where they couldn't guarantee their safety in the first place. They have a hard neck trying to bring it back, because if they lost the very little credibility they've left on asylum. But just a few words of caution to my Labour colleagues. It's great to see them so animated this morning. Obviously, this is a real target. We all love Tory bashing, and this presents such an obvious target for all of us, so enjoy yourself. But I warned them that they were talking about deterrence, and I was following that exchange with great interest between the Conservative member and one of the Labour members. What they've got at the heart of their bill is deterrence. If Rwanda wasn't going to work, so is the other features that they've got in this bill. Is that they take no account of deterrence when you're sitting in a war-torn region in the world. And I'm just wondering just how long it's going to take this Labour government to start to get into this territory, because I can see it coming, the backtracking on the IMA and some of the other features in this grotesque race to the bottom against who could be the hardest on reform. So I suspect that in a few years' time, the honourable gentleman on the Tory front bench might actually get his wish, and we'll start to see Rwanda Mark II coming from the Labour Party. And so I would just say to them, just think very carefully, particularly on the next clause about the IMA, about wandering down this particular route. But I have my doubts that they will resist the temptation to revisit some of the territory that the Conservatives trailblazed in their last stupid scheme.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank the member for Stockton West for his creative statement. The chaos in our asylum system and the dangerous rise in illegal small boat crossings is, of course, one of the greatest challenges facing our country. And for years, the British public have been promised solutions. They were told that the previous government's Rwanda policy would fix the problem. But instead, it proved a costly failure, stuck in legal battles, riddled with operational flaws and utterly ineffective. And I'll go into detail on those soon. In 2018, as I mentioned earlier, 299 people crossed the Channel on small boats. By 2022, that number had surged to 30,000, a 100-fold increase under the Conservatives' watch. And despite their grand claims that the Rwanda scheme would act as a deterrent, what actually happened, Chair? Over 80,000 people crossed the Channel after the scheme was announced, and not a single asylum seeker has been successfully removed under it. Not one. Chair, it is clear that this policy failed. Now let's start with the legal reality here. The Rwanda asylum scheme wasn't just controversial, it was unlawful. In November 2023, the UK Supreme Court struck it down, ruling that Rwanda was not a safe country to send asylum seekers. The reason for that were systematic defects in Rwanda's asylum system, where almost no claims from Afghans, Syrians or Yemenis were ever approved. The court found a serious risk that genuine refugees could be sent back to danger in direct breach of international law, Chair. And let's not forget that Rwanda has a track record here. A previous deal, as mentioned earlier by my honourable friend with Israel, led to refugees being secretly deported back to their home countries in clear violation again of human rights protections. It's a policy that depends on breaking the law, and that is not a policy at all. It's a legal and moral dead end. That's why this bill repeals the Rwanda scheme and replaces it with a system that upholds the rule of law. We'll focus on toughness where it belongs, not on desperate people, but on the criminal gangs who exploit them. Instead of wasting years in court, we will implement a legally sound system that actually works, Chair. And I'll go further. The Rwanda scheme wasn't just unlawful, it was an economic disaster. As of mid-2024, at least £318 million had already been spent on this failing policy. And what did the taxpayers get in return? Nothing. No removals, no deterrent effect, just an ever-growing backlog of cases and ever-rising hotel bills that we have inherited. Even if the scheme had gone ahead, it would have been staggeringly expensive. The National Audit Office estimated that removing just a few hundred people could cost up to £2 million per person. Yet we were expected to believe that this was a serious solution to the problem of tens of thousands arriving each year under the Conservatives' watch. Now, this government are putting an end to that waste. Instead of throwing money at a scheme that doesn't work, we're investing in practical measures, as you've heard. This approach is already delivering results. Since taking office, the new government has increased enforced removals by 24%, showing that when you have a working system, you don't need gimmicks like the Rwanda plan, you just need competence. So this is not just about law or economics, it's also about how we treat people. Because a core British value is strength, but also decency. And strength without decency is weakness, and that is what was being demonstrated by the previous government. The Rwanda scheme was not just ineffective, it was cruel. It was based on the idea that people fleeing war and persecution should be someone else's problem, no matter the risk to their safety. So let's be clear. Many of those crossing the channel are genuine refugees. They include people fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan, dictatorship in Iran, and war in Syria. But the Rwanda policy, and the Conservatives, it would seem, didn't care. It made no distinction. It lumped everyone together and treated them as a problem to be shipped off 4,000 miles away, out of sight and out of mind, although, of course, it didn't work. Now, that is not the British way. This country has a proud history of offering sanctuary to those in need. We do not abandon our humanitarian duties for the sake of a headline and a gimmick. Those who shouldn't be here, of course, will be deported, as we are already seeing, and those who genuinely need help will receive it under this government. A true deterrent is taking out the smuggling gangs and deporting those who shouldn't be here. And the truth is this: you do not stop the boats by shouting slogans, you stop the boats by giving people an alternative. Finally, Chair, and thank you for your patience, the Rwanda plan was never operationally viable. Even if it had survived legal challenges, the logistics were impossible. To make it work, the government would have had to detain nearly every small boat arrival indefinitely, a task for which we simply do not have the detention space, the staff, or the legal authority. Rwanda itself had agreed to take only a few hundred people per year, a drop in the ocean, excuse the pun, compared to the scale of the problem. Meanwhile, the real criminals, the smuggling gangs, continued to operate freely. The Rwanda plan did nothing to target them. It was an illusion of control rather than a real solution. Now, this government takes a serious, workable approach. That is how you secure the border, not through wishful thinking, but through real enforcement. The Conservatives have tried gimmicks. They tried grandstanding. They tried expensive, legally dubious, headline-chasing policies, and they failed. It's time to move forward, Chair, and we will uphold the rule of law, protect those in genuine need, and take real action against the criminals exploiting them.
Stewart. These are difficult problems and challenging questions. We can see that in the fact that practically every country in the Western world is struggling with this, and with the notable exception of Australia, effectively none have solved it. The basic logic of the situation is that if someone comes here illegally from a place to which it would be dangerous to return them, there are only the following 4 options. Firstly, they could be sent back to the country they came from. That is not legal in our current framework, and that's before even getting to the morality of doing such a thing. Secondly, they could be detained in immigration detention indefinitely. That is also not legal. A person can only be held in immigration detention if there is a realistic prospect of removal, which there wouldn't be in this case. Thirdly, they could stay here indefinitely. That is not fair and not what the public want. Or finally, they could go somewhere else, a safe third country. Such an agreement was very difficult to broker. Indeed, until the Rwandans agreed, many considered it to be impossible. Clearly, those on the government benches have little time for the Rwanda scheme, and destroying it was one of the first things that they did in office. But the basic logic problem remains. The last Conservative government did not get everything right, that is for sure. But the Rwanda scheme was a genuine attempt to solve this truly hard problem, and it remains the only solution we can see. I give way to the Honourable.
The Honourable Lady for giving way. Well, she accepts there's a 5th option in her list there, which just because someone doesn't have the right to be in the UK doesn't mean they don't have the right to go to any other country in the world. And the programme of voluntary returns, which massively went down under the Conservatives but has gone up massively under this government, is part of the solution to that.
As you've heard, people who've come here illegally actually are not voluntarily leaving the country. Most of the voluntary returns are to do with overstayers or people who haven't come here on small boats. There will always be people who come, but they don't. There will always be people who come to this country illegally from dangerous places. They are human beings responding to obvious incentives. So could the Minister tell us, please, which of the 4 options, sending someone back to a dangerous country, which will entail a change in the law and likely leaving the ECHR, holding someone in immigration detention indefinitely, which has the same conditions, allowing people to stay here, or sending them to a third country, does she think is the right one?
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure once again to serve under your chairpersonship. I was disappointed but not surprised to hear that the official opposition want to keep the Safety of Rwanda Act on the statute books. Disappointed for a number of reasons, which I'll go on to set out shortly. But I wasn't surprised, because I've seen the way the Tories continue to position and conduct themselves when it comes to immigration policy. It's clear to me that they simply refuse to learn the lessons of the last 12 months. The public saw right through their Rwanda plan. They could see it for exactly what it was, a gimmick, both unworkable and unaffordable. Ahead of today, I thought I would familiarise myself with the report stage and the 3rd reading of the Safety of Rwanda Act 2024 when it passed through the House of Commons. At the time, Chair, myself and a good number of the committee were yet to be elected. But reading the debate really brings across the sense of chaos that had engulfed the Conservative Party at the time. The then Shadow Home Secretary, now the current Home Secretary, summed it up by saying, "What a farce. We have a Prime Minister with no grip, while the British taxpayer is continually forced to pay the price. Former Tory cabinet ministers and deputy chairs from all sides have been queuing up to tell us that this is a bad bill. They say it will not work, it will not protect our borders, it will not comply with international law, and it is fatally flawed." We had a previous Attorney General, the current Right Honourable Member for Kenilworth and Southam, state that to arrogate to oneself the right to declare one's own compliance with international law runs the risk of first, other states finding comfort in our example, and secondly, undermining our own messages in other situations. This makes this not just a bad law, but bad foreign policy. This is an example of utter chaos. The Law Society, in welcoming the Rwanda Act repeal, in evidence to this committee, said that the Act set a dangerous legal and constitutional precedent by legislating to overturn an evidence-based finding of fact by UK courts that Rwanda is an unsafe country to send asylum seekers to. However, the bill did make it onto the statute books. The Rwanda plan ran for 2 years, and as we know and have heard several times this morning, a grand total of 4 volunteers were sent to Rwanda at the not insubstantial cost of £700 million to the UK taxpayer. Quite a remarkable feat. However, Whilst hundreds of millions of taxpayer pounds were being sent to Rwanda, the effect of the legislation was being felt here in the UK. As a result of the fantastical Rwanda plan, huge backlogs of asylum claims were building up, with tens of thousands of people in hotels unable to leave because of the design of the Illegal Migration Act. We know that the use of hotels do not represent value for money, and it's something that we are moving away from. When it comes to the idea of this policy being a deterrent, from its inception to when announced it was to be scrapped, 84,000 people crossed the channel in small boats. Now, Chair, while it's always difficult to measure the effectiveness of a deterrent, I think that this is a pretty clear indicator that a deterrent it was not. An important part of this scrutiny process is that we take the opportunity to hear from witnesses who have valuable expertise in this area. And I have to say, Chair, listening to the oral evidence and wading through the written, you don't have to dig too deep to find out what organisations and individuals think of this piece of legislation. We asked about the repeal of the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Act 2024, and the majority of the Illegal Migration Act. And at that point, Enver Solomon from the Refugee Council called the acts a disaster that caused a fundamental meltdown that resulted in the system pretty much coming to a standstill. The system slowed down, with productivity in asylum decisions making at its lowest level since the height of the COVID pandemic. In terms of the strain that such a system put on public services, he said, the number of people in hotels, asylum contingency accommodation as it's called, reached record numbers. Hotels were being stood up in communities without proper prior assessments with relevant agencies, of the potential needs, health, the NHS and tensions with the police. The Children's Commissioner also gave evidence and, speaking from a children's perspective, stated that, and I quote, "I am pleased to see the Rwanda Act repealed. Children told me it would not have stopped them coming. They were just going to disappear at 18. It would have ended up putting them at more risk." So, not good for children, not value for money, and with a huge increase in the asylum backlog. And when it comes to the idea of deterrent, we know the evidence suggests it would have been unsuccessful in that regard as well. We heard from Professor Brian Bell, who said the numbers are certainly not consistent with a story of a very significant deterrent effect from the Rwanda Act. The cost was staggering for a policy that was very unlikely to have a significant deterrent effect. Professor Bell then went on to say, "My personal view is that getting asylum claims dealt with more quickly would have been a much more effective use of public resources." I couldn't agree more, Chair. And that is what this government is focused on doing. This government has transferred staff and resources from the failed Rwanda scheme, and we have refocused our efforts on a new returns and asylum system and border security command, which has boosted levels of returns and enforcement. This, as we've heard from my colleague, from my honourable friend, has led to a 24% increase in enforced returns in our first 7 months for those who have no right to be in the UK. Some 19,000 people were returned by the end of January, including the 4 largest return charter flights in our country's history. We have seen a 38% increase in illegal working raids and arrests compared to the same period under the previous government. So, Chair, there are no more gimmicks, but instead investment in a workable system with new structures and resources to smash the gangs that cause so much misery to so many vulnerable people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I think it was interesting this morning to hear from the Right Honourable Gentleman that he considered the Rwanda scheme a crackpot scheme. Another opinion is that it's very unconservative and very un-British, and that was John Major, the former Conservative Prime Minister, that said that. I think what we have to acknowledge that the basic principle of this bill is to address the failures of past legislation. Indeed, it's already been explained by the Minister during an earlier debate that it's not possible to make the suite of legislation which involved the Rwanda Act and the Illegal Migration Act to work together coherently. To not repeal the Safety of Rwanda Act would undermine confidence in the credibility of the bill that we're all currently debating. We are moving away from a reliance on expensive gimmicks and hotel uses and the flaw that is the Rwanda Act, with a price tag of 700 million in taxpayers' money, and the failure to effectively process the people arriving on our shores. Do we really believe that clinging on to a piece of dead legislation in the way to protect our borders is the way to forward through and put the safety of our country in focus and at the front? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And may I start just by saying that it is a pleasure to serve with your chairpersonship, and I'm particularly enjoying the opportunity to have these debates in a free-flowing way, but obviously also sticking to parliamentary etiquette. And I also wanted to kind of commend the Honourable Member for Stockton West, who I do have some sympathy with. He's been sent here to defend the impossible. And I kind of half wondered when he came wearing that very fetching yellow tie, which I slightly covered, that he may be coming here to hold his hands in the air and make an apology and perhaps stand on the side of classical liberalism. But no, he stood true to the 2024 manifesto on which he was elected. I wanted to take on the points that the Honourable Member for Stockton West raised, particularly around how he would define a deterrent. So I hope in so doing I'm adding something new. When I asked him for a definition, he said that it would prevent people from coming, and it would do that by detaining and removing. So I want to be able to make a case which challenges his assumptions on that basis. If we think of a deterrent, it's relating to a strategy which is aimed at preventing external actors, targets in military senses, adversaries from taking unwanted actions. And if we consider deterrence in the case of this particular Rwanda asylum policy, I think the Conservative government would have needed to achieve certain things. To maintain the capabilities required to deter and be highly resolved to deploy them. So in that sense, as the Honourable Member Stockton West has said, to be able to detain and remove. To effectively communicate its resolve to act for deterrence to be effective. And as with any communication, you can communicate, but you need to be understood to be highly resolved and capable to follow through. So in order for the Rwanda asylum policy to be a deterrent, the government would have needed to persuade potential migrants of its capabilities and resolve to send them to Rwanda to process their claims on illegally entering the country. In order for the Rwanda asylum policy to have worked as a deterrent, the government would have needed to stop migrants from paying significant sums of money to smuggler gangs who were facilitating this illegal migration. In short, it feels from what the Honourable Member was saying that the principal target of deterrence was migrants. So on these key conditions, the Rwanda asylum policy was always doomed to fail because it's not able to achieve detention and it's not able to achieve removal. If you look at detention, Professor Brian Bell, the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee, told us that the numbers given by the government are certainly not consistent with a story of very significant deterrent effect from the Rwanda Act. Dr. Peter Walsh of the Migration Observatory cited concerns about where people would be detained. The UK immigration detention system only having capacity for 2,200 people, of which roughly 400 spaces were free. Moreover, Rwanda would struggle to process more than a few hundred asylum claims a year. That then takes me to the question of removal.
Just before he...
I'd happily give way.
Minister.
I thank Honourable Friend for giving way. Does he realise that the detention estate was also used by the party opposite to empty some of the prison places and try to relieve pressure there? So I think it's highly unlikely there would even be 400 spare places.
I thank my right honourable friend for that really important point, and it's another reminder that when the Labour government took office after that historic win, we inherited an awful mess in our prison systems, one which was described by independent experts and organisations as near collapse. I think our prison system was so near to collapse that there were just a few hundred spaces left at a time when the country was rioting. So I would happily give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. Is he also aware that under the previous government, the Home Office tried to secure additional detention estate for asylum seekers, but catastrophically failed to do so? For example, in North Eye, where they spent hundreds of millions of pounds to secure a site, far more than the previous owners had paid, and yet found it had contaminated ground and couldn't be used. Or indeed the Bibby Stockholm in Dover, which closed very swiftly after opening.
And I thank my honourable friend for that really important couple of points too. In fact, the Bibby Stockholm was moored just off a place near to my constituency.
Dorset.
In Dorset.
Sorry.
It's very south. It was more just off Dorset, and I commend the Honourable Member for South Dorset for campaigning so quickly and so efficiently to have the Bibby Stockholm closed, and I thank the government for responding so constructively to that request. And I agree entirely with what he's saying too, which is that we have seen significant challenges with the ability of the state to detain. And as a consequence, on one of the two conditions set out by the Honourable Member for Stockton West of an effective deterrent, it is clear that the Conservative government has failed. If we move to the next component of what would have been an effective deterrent, which is removal, I think we only need to look at the ultimate proof. Who went to Rwanda? What deportations actually happened? Now, I can anticipate what some of those challenges by the Conservatives opposite may be, so I'd like to take them on. First of all, they may blame this Labour government for cancelling the policy, without also saying that they, the Conservative Party, controlled the timing of a general election, that it seems they were certain to lose and they believed they were certain to lose, which is perhaps why they called the election before they could begin deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda. In fact, the first flight was set to take off on 24th of July. If the Conservatives had delayed the dissolution of Parliament by just 20 days, dissolving it on 19th of June rather than 30th of May, the first planes could have taken off. The last Prime Minister could have waited out those 20 days if he didn't have anything else to do. With a government that was not particularly showing ambition, a zombie government, if he himself wanted to show ambition, he could have spent a nice 20 days leisurely watching all 90 hours of the TV show Lost. If he'd wanted to go at a more leisurely pace rather than binge watching, and the Conservatives were excelling at going at a leisurely pace, he could have watched all 30 hours of the TV show Stranger Things. Instead, and this is where the bum comes in, the government just manifested signs of being lost, and the last Conservative cabinet just comprised Stranger Things. Elegant. And if the I thought I would try and find any moment of humour in what is a dispiriting debate on this topic. The Conservatives may also progress to blaming successful legal and judicial challenges of the policy. It was, as my honourable friend for Dover and Deal was just saying, unlawful and deemed as such by the courts. But in so doing, His Majesty's opposition should on one hand confirm whether they do respect the independence of our judiciary, who adjudicates such challenges, on the other, whether they respect the international human rights laws under which challenges were both made and were successful. And I think that's really important because one of the hallmarks of this new government is to be lawful and to respect our judiciary, and I think we need to be embracing that change. They could also reflect on the probability of further legal challenges being undertaken because of those human rights concerns in Rwanda, which again my honourable friend for Dover and Deal was highlighting so effectively. Lastly, the Conservatives may want to blame political challenges for undermining the credibility of their Rwanda asylum policy. In a democracy, it's of course right that people, members of Parliament, can raise concerns on behalf of their constituents. Indeed, that's what we have been doing. But they also overcame those political constraints by passing the Safety of Rwanda Bill to address judicial concerns, and they signed a legally binding agreement with Rwanda. So the idea that the deterrent was not able to function because of perhaps legal challenge or political challenge is actually farcical because the government had the cards in its hand. Now, I've also heard mentioned that the Conservatives could have followed the Australian asylum policy, and that has been described as a successful model, one perhaps which even inspired the Rwanda asylum policy. But there is good reason to believe that the UK could not have achieved the deterrent effects of the Australian offshore asylum processing model. Indeed, Professor Brian Bell, Chair of the Migration Advisory Committee, said in oral evidence to this committee that it was inappropriate to draw comparisons between the Rwandan and Australian policies when I asked him that. There are also challenges to assessing the efficacy of the Australian policy if we were to be generous and to accept the Honourable Member for Weald of Kent's view that that policy would stand out in the world as being successful. As the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, an expert and independent institution, has said, there is no compelling evidence to suggest that the Australian offshoring policy was in fact the reason for any drop in the numbers of people coming to Australia, going to Australia. So put bluntly, migrants, if they were paying close attention to the last government's policy, had no reason to believe that they would be barred from staying in the UK. But this takes me to my third and final definition of what would make an effective deterrent. Yes, the state must be understood to be highly resolved and highly capable to deter, to detain and to remove. But it takes two to tango. And Britain can only be understood if asylum seekers are able to understand. And this in turn depends on several key factors. It means migrants being able to do at least 3 things. Pay close attention to the last government's actions. Now, I struggle to pay close attention to the last government's actions, so I struggle to see how asylum seekers would. To stay fully informed about the many twists and turns in the Rwanda asylum policy, and I again struggle to stay abreast of those twists and turns, and to behave as rational actors who would weigh up the costs and benefits of action. But again, we've heard as testimony and oral evidence that migrants are typically unaware of government policy and actions because they're too busy being asylum seekers and migrants. And moreover, there are, it can be said, reasonable grounds to believe that the chaotic and difficult circumstances that they are forced to inhabit prevent them from being the rational actors they would otherwise be, calmly and objectively assessing the trade-offs between the perceived cost of illegal entry and the probability of them being incurred, and whether they could be outweighed by the potential benefits of migration. It's also right, if we're querying the ability of the asylum seeker seeking to come to the UK to behave rationally, to assess in fact whether the government itself was acting rationally. And as Professor Brian Bell said, the Rwanda policy was a product of a problem in the Home Office at the time where there was little rational thinking about what the costs and benefits of different policies were. And then lastly, it's worth ruminating on the additional emotional reasons why a migrant considering an illegal and dangerous crossing might be motivated to do so. As we heard in oral evidence, our country exercises a very strong pull effect on migrants seeking a new life, which means they may be willing to pay smugglers large sums of money for dangerous crossings. And here I particularly want to commend my honourable friend for Edinburgh East and Mossaba, who has made the point repeatedly throughout this committee that demand is inelastic. And as a consequence, we need to find a way of meeting that particular nature of that demand. And so, in that case, I particularly want to pick up the point which the Minister summed up well at second reading. Conservative members started off by saying that all they had to do was talk about the Rwanda scheme and it would be a deterrent. Then, it was once we've put it on the statute book, it will be a deterrent. And now, all of a sudden it's, oh well, it never worked because not a plane took off. The Minister was right. Just talking about a scheme does not create a deterrent effect. The number of people taking the Channel route did not fall following the policy's announcement, according to a 25th of July Q&A by Peter Walsh of the Migration Observatory. Putting it on the statute book does not create a deterrent effect. 84,000 people crossed the Channel from the day the policy was announced to the day it was scrapped by this new government. And as I've outlined, the deterrent effect was never going to work because planes did not take off under a Conservative government, and they were never going to take off under a Conservative government. As Dr. Walsh says in the report I cited earlier, the probability of a person crossing the Channel in a small boat being sent to Rwanda is around 1 to 2%. If only a few hundred asylum seekers were sent to Rwanda, as the Deputy Prime Minister of the Conservative government and the Home Office's modelling suggests. And the costs of this fiasco are extraordinary. The Conservatives lost control of our borders. They made our asylum and immigration system dysfunctional. Their plans did not work. Over 84,000 people crossed the Channel between the announcement of the scheme and the scrapping. An eye-watering £700 million of taxpayers' money was hemorrhaged on a system which the Conservatives knew could not and did not work. And for 3 years they invested and poured all of their energies and all of their time and all of this country's focus on asylum and immigration into the failed Rwanda gimmick instead of focusing on the source of the small boats problem, the organised criminality behind the highly lucrative trade in people smuggling. And in closing, that's why I commend this new Labour government's new border security bill. It will put right what the Conservative government got so wrong and unfortunately today continue to defend. It strengthens border security that was weakened and undermined by the last government. It will bring in counter-terrorism-like powers, strengthen international cooperation and coordinate and command so that everybody in every part of our system are pulling in the same direction, going after the criminal gangs at the source of the small boats problem. As Martin Hewitt, the Border Security Commander, says, there is no simple answer to stopping the small boat crossings. We need a toolbox which is filled with tools. To coordinate is to command, to disrupt is to deter. And that, thankfully, is what this bill will do. And in so doing, it will thankfully replace the failed Rwanda gimmick.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would like to place on record my support for the Minister and Government's decision to repeal the Safety of Rwanda Act. It's important to remember this bill was passed by a Conservative government that knew it was on its way out, a government that had run out of road and out of ideas. The Safety of Rwanda bill was nothing more than a gimmick, something that's been mentioned many times this morning. It was a waste of taxpayers' money and only reaffirmed the widely held view that the Conservative government had lost control of our borders. Chair, the bill brought forward by the Labour government aims to tackle an extremely challenging issue, one made far more challenging thanks to the incompetence shown by the previous incumbents. The shift from wasting taxpayers' money on projects such as the Rwanda scheme to a plan that will genuinely aim to smash criminal gangs, address small boat crossings at the source with a consistent approach of respecting the vulnerability of the human lives involved is welcome, and that is why we must reject Conservative attempts to continue their failed schemes. You would have thought that the lessons of July last year for those opposite would be to look outwards, consider what went wrong, and reassess their positions on key matters such as immigration. But clearly they are carrying on as they have done for years and are insistent on making the same mistakes that cost millions to the public purse, millions that could have been spent on supporting the working people of the United Kingdom. I reiterate my support for the repeal of the Rwanda scheme and look forward to supporting this government's plans for restoring control to our borders and delivering on the priorities of the British people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, especially after we've had such an interesting debate with so many thoughtful contributions today. I want to just make a couple of points in response to some of the issues that have been raised. My honourable friend from Bournemouth East mentioned that I keep quoting Peter Walsh, and I'm going to again, actually, because I think the point he made in the evidence sessions was one of the most critical points in immigration policy in Britain overall, when he said that demand for channel crossings is, quote, fairly inelastic. What that tells us is that the demand will not wax and wane hugely in response to government policy. And that tells us that deterrence will only have limited uses. And this is the conceptual flaw at the heart of Rwanda. The Rwanda plan is it put all the country's cards and all the country's money on a deterrence-only approach. And one of the things is deterrence, first of all, has to be real and believable, which this one clearly wasn't. But in response to Member for Perth and Kinross's points about the role of deterrence in migration policy, I'm listening closely to what he says. And I think the exchanges that we're having is helping to clarify the thinking. But what's clear from the legislation that we've got here is that deterrence can only ever be a component. We also have to focus on the supply of the ability for people to cross the channel, not just the demand for it. And that requires the measures in this bill, but also diplomatic work and upstream work. I have to say, the fact that we're here today repealing this legislation was inevitable and written in the stars from the very beginning of this harebrained scheme. The European Council on Foreign Relations, before the Rwanda legislation passed, said it was doomed to failure and a floundering disaster because it was unlikely to deter illicit immigration, it would damage the UK's standing in international law, it would endanger refugee lives, and it would come at huge financial cost. Every single one of them came to pass, so it's no surprise we're having to deal with this today. And I would also say it presaged the Conservatives going down to a historic election defeat, so it was clearly a failure politically for them as well. On the point about removal to third countries, before we left the European Union, the UK did have the capacity to remove people to safe countries in the EU that they had travelled through. And the Conservatives manifestly failed to avail the country of that power that we had. Then we have failed in the Rwanda system. So clearly the Conservative track record on third countries is very poor. And I would say that there is a component in the immigration system for people going to third countries when they have no right to stay here. And that's something we need to look at further ahead. The member for Stockton West made a reference to the Albania relationship and returns increasing to Albania, as if somehow that proves that the Rwanda scheme would have worked if we just let it take its course. I have to say it's a completely spurious parallel. Firstly, the returns, the fall in the increase in the returns to Albania happened before the communique was signed with Albania. The two are not correlated. If he's perhaps trying to argue that the readmission agreement before it is the variable that led to the increase, that preceded that came after the spike, so it can't be held responsible. Albania was not just illegal immigrants, it also included a huge number of foreign national offenders, so it's a different group of people as we're talking about here. And also, it was people from Albania returning to Albania. It wasn't third country nationals. So I think the idea that the Albania scheme somehow is an alibi for Rwanda can be completely rejected. But that is not actually the point. The point is this Rwanda scheme would never have worked at a scale required, even if it had been able to work at all. The Minister was quite correct in her initial remarks when she talked about the interaction between the Illegal Migration Act and the Rwanda Act. What it meant was nobody was getting processed, and the country ended up with a perma backlog of asylum seekers sitting with nowhere to go, either to a third country, to the country they came from, in a voluntary returns agreement, or being recognised as refugees. And Rwanda would never have worked at a meaningful scale to deal with that backlog that had accrued. We were on a track to having to take over half the hotels in the country to accommodate asylum seekers. Now, we can have a debate about how best you manage an asylum system. Voluntary returns, swift processing, meaningful decisions and removals are clearly components of it. But we can surely say in debating this clause that the Rwanda Act was not the solution to it. £240 million of my constituents and other members' constituents' money was wasted on this scheme. The member for Perth and Kinross was quite correct when he called it absolutely crackpot, because passing legislation to assert reality isn't what it is never going to be an effective way to govern anything, never mind the asylum system. So I'm pleased to see this bill will finally be off the statute book.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. I think we've had a really interesting debate about the Safety of Rwanda Act in the context of taking it off the statute book, which is what the clause we're discussing at the moment, clause 37, does. I think I'm probably a bit distressed to realise that the party opposite, the main opposition party, is continuing to assert, without any evidence, in fact contrary to most of the evidence, that the Asylum, that the Safety of Rwanda Act and the Illegal Migration Act was just about to work, just on the cusp of being a great success when the evil new government came along and cancelled it. I would have thought, and it's possible to speculate, Mr. Stewart, that actually secretly many of them are really pleased that they can assert that, because it gets them out of an embarrassing, expensive farrago that will go down in history in this country as one of the most catastrophic pieces of legislation that Parliament has ever had to deal with. It's not ordinary or normal for one of your ex-Prime Ministers, John Major, in this case, as my honourable friend, the member for Dagenham and Rainham, quite rightly pointed out in her speech, that an ex-Prime Minister, an ex-Conservative Prime Minister, says and pronounces that the Safety of Rwanda Act was unconservative. This act was many things, unconservative is one of them. I think we on this side of the House, and also the member for Perth and Kinross assert that it was actually not a deterrent. We're in a situation in the discourse at the moment, Mr. Stewart, where we're saying it's not a deterrent and we can prove it, and the party opposite, who are responsible for it, are basically left just asserting that it was a deterrent, even though there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever in all of the years of its existence on the statute book. It's being announced as a potential future scheme, that it actually acted as a deterrent in any way whatsoever. It reminds me of some of those discussions that I used to have as a student, which is a very, 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 very long time ago, Mr. Stewart, about communism and whether communism, in its pure sense, had ever existed. It was obviously a failure, but actually when one came across the ideologues, they simply asserted that it wasn't the communism that had been tried to date, just wasn't pure enough, and therefore it was still likely to succeed if ever it was tried properly. Does that sound familiar to some of the discussions that we're having around this iteration of fantasy asylum policy as gimmick? Because I think it does. What we're now close to hearing from the party opposite is that Rwanda hasn't been tried properly, even though it's wasted £715 million of taxpayers' money, that somehow it was just about to work when the dastardly new government that was elected by a landslide, it has to be said, somehow decided it would stop what was going to inevitably work from actually existing. This is arrant nonsense, and I'm disappointed, I must say, to hear the party opposite from its birth in opposition continue to spout it. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this policy worked, was beginning to work, or would have ever worked, as many of the contributions that we've heard from my honourable friends on this side of the committee have pointed out. This was a policy that wasn't a deterrent. It was a catastrophic waste of taxpayers' money, and it risked our reputation as a country having respect for the rule of law internationally, which would have had and had begun to have many consequences for our reputation and our ability to influence other powers. Let's just look at the costs that were published for the scheme. There was a breakdown of Home Office costs for the Migration Economic Development Partnership with Rwanda that was published on the 2nd of December in 2024. The party opposite were going to pay £150,874 per individual sent to Rwanda. The government of Rwanda only ever agreed to take 300. 84,000 people crossed the channel while the party opposite were talking about the Rwanda scheme. You don't have to be that much of a mathematician to do the maths on all of this to understand how much deporting large numbers of people would have cost if one had to pay £150,874 per person over 5 years for each person who had been deported. Had it been possible to deport them, had Rwanda agreed to take more than the 300 that they've agreed to take, it would have cost a fortune, and this is without talking about all of the extra IT that had to be designed, which had to be written off, the cost of that, building new detention accommodation. We've only got 2,500 detention spaces at the moment, although this government is building some more so that we can try to get some integrity back to our system with enforced returns. But we certainly wouldn't have had anywhere to put 84,000 people pending their deportation to Rwanda. So I don't know where the detention camps were going to be, or who was going to guard them, or what it would have cost to escort that number of people out of the country to somewhere else. And that is, of course, without some of the situation that is now happening in the Republic, in Rwanda, with the incursion by M23 into the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've actually now had to place sanctions on the Rwandan regime for the way in which they are involved in what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the displacement of nearly 1 million people in that particular area. I don't know whether in the fantasy world that some members of the opposition seem to still inhabit, Rwanda would still be a safe place, or just because we asserted legislatively at one point in time, sometime in the past, that Rwanda was safe, that it would always and everywhere have been safe. But there are many, many flaws with I'll give way in a second. There are many, many flaws with the way that this legislation was conceived of, was enacted, was put on the statute book, and was never actually operationalised in any way. But actually, history continuing to happen, events continuing to happen, also may well have impinged. I give way to you, Honourable Gentleman.
So I've asked this question a few times, never quite got the bottom of it. Rwanda is a place that we were sending people who could not return, where we could not return people to a safe country, where their home country was not safe. Where are those people going to go now, if not Rwanda? And does she fear that, as the Honourable Member for Perth and Kinross said, you might end up coming back to this in a few years' time when you realise that things are continuing to go the wrong way?
First things first, the Honourable Gentleman wasn't only going to send those who we couldn't return to their own countries back to Rwanda. He was, in theory, going to deport absolutely everybody who arrived to claim asylum after March 2023 to Rwanda. That was what we were told was actually going on. In reality, they all ended up in hotels, being unable to be processed, just growing in numbers, while the party opposite indulged their gimmicks, their expensive gimmicks, and their fantasy of how the world should be. And at the same time, there are many of colleagues who've spoken today who've pointed out that the day job, while this parallel universe policy was being developed, the day job wasn't actually being done either. It took all of the attention off running what is a complex enough system as it is, and many resources were diverted to trying to create this new reality. And what happened was neglect of the system, huge backlogs, which were built into the system because of the way the Illegal Migration Act interacted with the Safety of Rwanda Act, which made it impossible to run the current system, impossible to move to a new system that was remotely workable, thereby landing this country with a huge dysfunctional series of backlogs and a system that we have had to literally start up from scratch to try to get working in any coherent way. Again,
I know maybe she's going to answer the second part of the Honourable Gentleman's question, but would you be so brave enough to tell this committee today, at this point, that this Labour government will never, ever consider putting asylum seekers, refugees, to a third-party country in the lifetime of this government? Would she be so brave as to state that today?
Well, the Home Secretary has said that she doesn't rule out third country processing, which is not the same as the Rwanda scheme. That was deportation to a third country permanently. It's not the same thing at all. If he's talking about third country returns, such as such as reviving the Dublin system, or perhaps remembering, as one was negotiating the Withdrawal Act, that perhaps they should have done something about returning to Europe, perhaps we would have been in a different situation, but that is also a third country return. So the Honourable Gentleman's asked quite a wide-ranging question. I've been as honest as I can in answering it at this point. So we could spend all day, and probably many, many more days, Mr. Stewart, talking about the failure that is encompassed in the Safety of Rwanda Act and its interaction with the Illegal Migration Act. What our job today, though, is to tidy it up, and Clause 36 will take the Safety of Rwanda Act off the statute book and put it in the dustbin of history where it belongs. 37. And I move.
The question is that Clause 37 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no.
No. Aye.
No. Division. Lock the doors.
Sarah Ball. No. Jade Botterill.
Aye.
Dame Angela Regal.
Aye.
Becky Gittins.
Aye.
Tom Hayes.
Aye.
Katie Lamb.
No.
Martin McCluskey.
Aye.
Margaret Mullane.
Aye.
Chris Murray.
Aye.
Kenneth Stevenson.
Aye.
Mike Tack.
Aye.
Matt Vickers.
No.
Joe White.
Aye.
Pete Wishart.
Aye.
The ayes were 11, the noes were 3. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. The Liberal Democrat spokesman is not here to move Amendment 9, so we move on to the question that Clause 38 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate new Clause 2.
Pete, I think. Yes. You want me to move Clause 38 first?
Yes, I think it is indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. The Lib Dems, as always, are keeping us on our toes, and I hope that there's a benign reason for the fact that they're not in attendance today, and it's not that my horrible cold made its way over there, or that the individuals are not well. So, what Clause 36 does, it repeals the vast majority, but not all, of the Illegal Migration Act 2023. We decided not to take a blanket approach to repealing it all, and we're going to have this debate when the Honourable Member for Perth and Kinross moves his new clause to the amendment. And so the choice that he has given us is to repeal as a whole the Illegal Migration Act. Our view, and I will come on to this in response to his speech, is that there are a few useful clauses that we have decided to keep on the statute book, and I hope to explain to him as he moves his new clause why that is. But just in general, we all know that the Illegal Migration Act was a flawed piece of legislation which made it impossible for us to process and run asylum claims. It was on the statute book in the context of a Safety of Rwanda Act, which assumed that anyone who arrived after March 2023 wouldn't be subjected or be allowed to become part of an asylum claim in this country. It had in it the so-called duty to remove, which put on the Home Secretary a statutory duty to remove everyone who came after that time to this country. It was flawed in many ways, but it made it impossible, Mr. Stewart, for us to run an asylum claim in this country lawfully. Therefore, it's really important that the vast majority of this flawed piece of legislation should be removed from the statute book, and that is what Clause 38 does. I will come back in more detail about the clauses, the 6 clauses of the Act that we've decided to keep, and try to explain, not least to the Honourable Member for Perth and Kinross and the rest of the committee, what the thinking behind that is in each case, but I'll leave that debate until the new clause has been moved.
Vickers.
Thank you. Clause 38 repeals sections 1 to 6 and schedules 1, sections 7 to 11, sections 13 to 15 and schedule 2, sections 16 to 28. sections 30 to 51, sections 53 to 58, section 61 and section 66 of the Illegal Migration Act. Section 2 of the Illegal Migration Act placed a duty on the Home Secretary to make arrangements to remove persons to their home country or a safe third country who have entered or arrived in the UK illegally. Let me point out to those people who are concerned about genuine asylum seekers that Section 2.4 of the IMA makes it clear that the provision does not apply if someone comes directly from a place of danger. That is consistent with Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention. But people who come here directly from France, a safe country where no one is being persecuted, which has a perfectly well-functioning asylum system, should not illegally enter the United Kingdom. I asked the Minister why the government is repealing this duty. Is it because they do not think they are able to remove those who have arrived illegally? Is it because the government thinks people who arrive in this country illegally should be allowed to remain? Section 5 of the Illegal Migration Act provides that asylum claims are automatically deemed inadmissible for those who have arrived illegally. One of Labour's first actions in government was to allow illegal migrants to claim asylum. Can the Minister explain how allowing illegal migrants to claim asylum is providing any deterrent? Surely this will help smuggling gangs by providing a stronger incentive for people to make those dangerous crossings of the Channel in small boats.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. The Illegal Migration Act, which we're discussing as part of this clause, was put onto the statute book by the previous government, but the previous government didn't actually commence much of it at all. Could the Honourable Member explain why that was?
Well, I think there's lots to be doing in the way of commencement. It's there. It could be commenced at any time if the government felt it was of help. In fact, in a few years' time, when they come back to the drawing board to try and find a deterrent, they might well want to do that. Sections 31 and 32 of the Illegal Migration Act prevented people who have entered the country illegally from obtaining British citizenship. The Labour government is repealing this provision. This position is hardly surprising when the Prime Minister does not think that British citizenship is a pull factor, but it does not mean it's the right thing to do. Why have the government repealed this clause and are allowing illegal migrants to get British citizenship? Does the government not believe that British citizenship is a privilege and not a right, especially for those who have entered the country illegally? If so, why have the government not included measures to stop illegal migrants from obtaining British citizenship and instead only issued guidance that says applications for British citizenship made after the 10th of February 25 that include illegal entry will normally be refused citizenship, regardless of when the illegal entry occurred. Section 58 of the Illegal Migration Act said the Secretary of State may make regulations about the effect of a decision by a relevant person not to consent to the use of specific scientific method for purposes of age assessment, where there are no reasonable grounds for the person's decision. This means that if a migrant refused to undergo an age assessment, they would be considered an adult. Labour have removed age assessments for illegal migrants who claim to be under 18, resulting in the risk that grown men may end up in schools with teenage girls. In fact, the most recent data on age disputes shows that over 50% of migrants claiming to be under 18 were actually adults. How does the government therefore intend to ensure that migrants claiming to be under 18 actually do undergo age assessment, and why is this not included in the bill? The SNP amendment would have repealed the Illegal Migration Act entirely, so they must be agreeing with the Labour government that illegal migrants should be able to get British citizenship and should not have to undergo age assessments. Therefore, I ask the same questions to the SNP. Does the SNP not believe that British citizenship is a privilege and not a right, especially for those who've entered the country illegally? How would the SNP ensure that migrants claiming to be under 18 actually do undergo age assessments? And why is this not included in the SNP amendment? By repealing the Illegal Migration Act in its entirety, the SNP want to stop the seizure of mobile phones from illegal migrants, which helps establish identities and obtain evidence of immigration offences. As Tony Smith said, passport data, identity data, age data and travel history data are often held on those phones, all data that would be useful when considering an asylum application. The Liberal Democrat amendment would repeal Section 29 of the Illegal Migration Act, which requires the Secretary of State to remove people who sought to use modern slavery protections in bad faith. Do the Liberal Democrats think using modern slavery protections fraudulently people using modern slavery protections fraudulently should be allowed to stay in the UK? If so, do they believe people who make fraudulent immigration claims should be allowed to stay in the UK? We believe that the effect of repealing the majority of the IMA and the entirety of the Safety Rwanda Act will be increasing in people arriving in this country illegally and remaining. So I'd ask the government whether they would be prepared to be transparent about the numbers. If they are convinced that the approach set out in this bill will be successful, let us measure it. Would the Minister commit to publishing all numbers and the nationalities of all those who might have been excluded from the UK asylum system on grounds of connection with a safe third country or a late claim, but have not been, with reasons why not, setting out the obstacles to returning them to their country of origin, and what steps are being taken through international agreements to overcome this, as recommended by Tony Smith in evidence to this committee? We will wish to oppose the inclusion of this clause by way of division.
Pete Wishart. And thank you very much, Mr Stewart. And can I say to the Honourable Member for Stockton, he really doesn't want to know my views on British citizenship because it's quite likely to blow his head, but we'll leave that one at that just then. And it is disappointing to note the absence of our Liberal colleagues. Can I just say, back in the day, the good old days, Mr Stewart, when we had an effective, efficient, diligent and conscientious third party, there would always be somebody there to ensure that the views of the third party was represented. And I'm sure they've got very good excuses, but I really do hope they start to take a bit of interest in this really important bill, because it has been disappointing thus far. And can I say to the Minister, useful clauses? Come on. We're talking about sections 29, sections 12, sections 59, section 60 and section 62. Some of the most nastiest and pernicious parts and aspects of the Illegal Migration Act. And I cannot believe that this government would want to continue to pursue this horrible and heinous Tory set of proposals and clauses in this particular bill. This was their great opportunity to wipe the slate clean from the past government with this hopeless and useless crackpot Rwanda scheme and this heinous, horrible, illegal immigration bill. And I'll just give a few quotes to the Minister from some of her colleagues, some of them that I wish I'd come up with myself, when the Prime Minister says it drives a coach and horses through protections for women trafficked to the UK as victims of modern slavery. Then there's the Home Secretary who said that the IMA does the total opposite of providing support for those who have been trafficked, and said it was nothing other than a trafficker's charter. There's prize quotes, Mr Stewart, from the Home Secretary and various ministers within the Home Office, absolutely and totally correct, right and true about this horrible Illegal Migration Act. And now we have a Labour government inconceivably standing by large swathes of a bill that they so rightly, widely rubbished and wanted rid of only a short while ago. It would be different if the government were maintaining some benign, useful or helpful parts of this Tories bill, but they are maintaining some real and pernicious nasties. And provisions that were damaging, dangerous and contrary to human rights under the Tories are just as damaging, dangerous and contrary to human rights under this new Labour government. And I'll remind the Minister of what the former Home Secretary said when she was introducing this bill. I am unable to make a statement that, in my view, the provisions of the Illegal Migration Bill are compatible with the Convention rights, but the government wishes the House to proceed with the bill anyway. They couldn't care less, the previous government, about our obligations under international law, about human rights, and they were quite happy to set them aside. And now we have a Home Secretary that stands by certain provisions of this particular bill with all of its difficulties concerning its relationship with convention rights. Yes, of course.
You will have noted on the front of the bill we're debating the statement from the Home Secretary on European Convention on Human Rights. In my view, the provisions of Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill are compatible with Convention rights.
I'm glad that the Home Secretary raised that, because she always does when it comes to our relationship with human rights and our compatibility. But I want to raise a couple of issues and ask her a couple of questions, just how it is very loosely connected with our obligations and just some of the real concerns that we have human rights. But I'll come to that in the course of my, what hopefully will be a short contribution. But it's completely incomprehensible that the government chose to repeal only some aspects of the IMA rather than the Act, particularly as so many members of the government have been so vocally opposed to the IMA in the past. But can we please just have a look at some of the stuff that they're wanting to retain? Now, the one that concerns me most, and the one that concerns the range of organisations and groups and charities associated with refugees and asylum seekers, is the retention of Section 29. Now, let's just remind this committee what Section 29 does. It extends the public order disqualification originally introduced by Section 63 of the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, and it mandates that victims of trafficking and modern slavery who have criminal convictions or are considered a threat to public order be disqualified from support and protection. Now, to me, this provision is deeply concerning, as it means that victims of trafficking, many of whom have been coerced into committing crimes as part of their exploitation, could face detention, deportation or removal rather than the support and the recovery that they actually need. It's claimed... Of course, give way, yeah.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. And I wonder whether he is aware that prior to Section 29 coming into place, Home Office figures show that up to 73% of foreign national offenders were using modern slavery as a means to avoid deportation, which could in turn put members of the public in danger.
Can I just say to the I don't know where he gets these figures, but let me give him some Home Office statistics back in return. The Home Office statistics from 2024 revealed that 70% of the individuals disqualified under this provision had elements of criminal exploitation in their case. 70% had criminal exploitation in this case. And this is what is so wrong about this particular section in this measure, is it damages and stops us giving the necessary and relevant support that we should and we owe people who have been victims of human trafficking. Yes, of course.
Thank you for giving way. I wonder if he also realises that under compelling circumstances, of course, those who have been convicted and apply for this, if there's that evidence that they've been victims of modern slavery, will fit into that system.
This is where we start to get back into very uncomfortable and very dangerous territory, where it's going to be up to the individual to prove that they are guilty of such crimes. A blanket clause which will entrap them and leave it to them to make their way through the courts in order to prove their innocence when they've been innocent all the time, or particularly when they've been victims of trafficking and forced into criminal activity. But what this does, Mr. Stewart, is it means that this system could punish vulnerable individuals who were coerced into committing crimes, often by their traffickers, thus reinforcing the power dynamic that allows traffickers to exploit their victims further. The retention of Section 29 increases the likelihood of re-trafficking and re-exploitation, as victims may fear coming forward, and I'll say that to the Honourable Gentleman, to the authorities due to the threat of detention, removal or criminalisation. And this has got issues for us in Scotland, Mr. Stewart. Now, quite rightly, I suppose, immigration is totally and utterly reserved. But we have responsibility under our devolved powers to ensure that victims of modern slavery who come to Scotland are looked after and attended to by Scottish legislation. There are the powers that we have within ours. Now, the retaining the IMA, the bill also restricts that ability of the Scottish Government to support these victims under the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act 2015. The Scottish Act places a duty on Scottish ministers to secure immediate support and recovery services for victims of human trafficking and exploitation. Now, unlike this bill, what we've tried to design in Scotland is a system that places an emphasis on victim care and rehabilitation. That is the approach that we take in Scotland, and that is what we want to try and deliver within our range of devolved power. Now, that relies, Mr Stewart, on the national referral mechanism identifying and supporting victims of trafficking. The disqualification provisions in Section 29 could result in vulnerable individuals in Scotland being detained or deported without being properly identified and supported as trafficking victims, thus weakening the Scottish Government's ability to implement its own modern slavery protections. Then there's the retention of Section 59. Now, I don't know how this is going to be considered to be useful, but I'd be interested in the Minister's use of this, which makes asylum and human rights claims from a range of countries inadmissible. Additionally, this bill introduces worrying new measures that expand the scope of immigration offences and the government's ability to detain migrants. Now, while ECAP has not been entirely incorporated into UK law, some of its obligations have been implemented by the Modern Slavery Act 2015. At that point, Mr Stewart, you remember that was seen as landmark achievement and pioneering legislation. This is now being hollowed out with survivor protections restricted, undermined and effectively erased by legislation such as this. Section 12 of the IMA enables the executive to decide the length and all forms of immigration detention, intending to overturn an established common law principle which provides for judicial oversight over the length of detention as an important safeguard against arbitrary detention is to be retained. This will go with the retention of that particular section. Section 59 of the IMA extends the current general admissibility process for asylum claims from nationals of EU member states, including Albania, that we've debated at such length in committee proceedings so far. India and Georgia are also added by the prior government, despite concerns about their general safety. This, regardless of the fact that the UK's country policy information on Albania notes issues with trafficking or sexual and criminal exploitation, and those targeted on the basis of sexual orientation. Similarly, Georgian officials have been the subject of UK sanctions in recent months for a brutal crackdown on media and protesters. Now they will not be able to secure any rights in the UK. Then there's Section 60 of the IMA. Section 60 of the IMA, rather than introducing new safe routes that's urgently required, places a duty on the executive to make regulations containing a cap, not a quota, but a cap on the number of persons who may enter the United Kingdom annually using safe routes. And lastly, Mr Stewart, if that's not enough, there's Section 62. Section 62 would mean that if a person making a human rights or asylum claim did not follow the Home Office instruction to look at everything, including private sensitive information on the phone, then the Home Office could take that into account as damaging the person's credibility when deciding whether to believe that person. This provision must also be considered in connection with the new extended powers in the bill to search, seize and retain mobile devices. Now, I scoured the Illegal Migration Act for anything that could remotely be described as useful or helpful within the provisions that the government are seeking to retain, whether it could help and assist this government. And what it tells us, what's all about, what this bill and all of this sitting through all these sessions is primarily focused on, which is smashing the gangs and disrupting the business operation and organisation. I could not find one thing. Mr Stewart, it's only with the full repeal of this horrible, harmful Tory bill and the introduction of stronger protections for victims of trafficking and modern slavery can we protect the vulnerable, uphold human rights and ensure justice for those who have suffered exploitation and abuse. I beg to move.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, and it's again a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Just as I said in the Safety of Rwanda clause, this clause was another inevitability because it was clear from the absolute outset that the Illegal Migration Act, the sections here, were never going to work. I remember, I know the Conservatives tend to think that everybody who works in the migration sector was setting out to thwart their plans at every turn, but that's not the case, because I remember 2 years ago working for the Strategic Migration Partnership in Scotland as we got the Illegal Migration Bill through, and sitting down with local authorities and the police and key stakeholders and looking at this legislation, and all of us collectively saying, how is this going to work? This is never going to be feasible in reality. And I want to draw people's attention to one component that's being repealed that I think brings the failure of the IMA to the fore. So it brought in the duty to remove on the Home Secretary that applied to all asylum seekers, regardless of their case. And then for anyone under 18, the duty to remove kicked in at the age of 18. But when we were working with local authorities, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children come across and seek asylum in this country. These are among the most vulnerable people you can imagine in the world. They have lost their loved ones, they are on their own, they are in a strange country. And then what we do in the UK is we have a national transfer scheme to disperse them around different local authorities in the UK. And I worked with the officers who were trying to help these children, after a really traumatic experience, get themselves together. But the Illegal Migration Act, when it was passed, meant that at the age of 18, in theory, those people would be eligible for immediate removal. What do you think it did to those children in terms of trying to secure any services, trying to learn English, trying to get any education? It made it impossible for them. And a direct impact, not that they left the country, but that they disappeared. And they are out there, probably some of them being exploited right now, and as a direct consequence of the clauses in the Illegal Migration Act. Now, the thing about that is not just that it put those children at risk, but actually it put incredible pressure on overstretched local services around the country. And for the government to set out to use immigration legislation to put further pressure on overstretched local services is only going to have negative consequences in communities, and it should never have happened. The duty to remove more broadly, which this clause repeals, essentially shut the asylum system down and created what IPPR has called a perma-backlog. Now, we've talked about deterrence and incentives, but I don't see any greater incentive for someone seeking to exploit the asylum system in this country than shutting it down overall, which is what this clause did. It created a vicious circle, which was both frankly bad for asylum seekers themselves, because genuine refugees had to spend years in hotel accommodation, which is not a particularly nice thing to do. It was bad for the taxpayer in the UK, because costs soared from £18,000 in 2019 to £47,000 per asylum seeker per year in 2024. And it was bad for communities because you couldn't move people through that process, and it clearly put pressure on a febrile system, a febrile situation on immigration. So it's good that we are repealing this clause, and as I say, it was inevitable because it was never going to work. And then finally, I want to turn to the points very briefly that the member for Perth and Kinross has made about human trafficking. I do understand the points that he's making, and it is really important we offer the victims of modern slavery proper protections, especially when they are forced to commit crimes in the force of their trafficking. This legislation doesn't completely take that power away. But I have to again, drawing my experience in the last couple of years, and there was an increase in exploiters and those who were actually perpetrators of trafficking using the trafficking system to evade prosecution. I worked closely with Police Scotland and the Crown Office, including actually in Perth and Kinross Council area, when we saw, particularly from the Vietnamese community, the growth of this development. So it's not that we have to not see the world in black and white. I'm not by any means saying that every victim of trafficking is somehow an imposter and we must stop them getting any protection. But it is happening, and so it's proper that we keep the legislation clauses in place so we can tackle that. Because actually, if you don't have that component, your system will break down. And just as we saw with the asylum system, if you don't have clauses to make the system functional, it breaks down and everybody loses. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And it's an honour to follow the speech there by my honourable friend for Edinburgh, East and Musselburgh, who I think in a really rather outstanding way set out the major challenges with the legislation, that part of which will be repealed. I just want to knock on the head, really, about 4 things that were said by the Honourable Member for Stockton West. The first was in reference to Section 23 of the Illegal Migration Act 2023. This provision that the opposition is talking about was never implemented by the last government. So, in effect, he's opposing a repeal of something that his last government never started, which feels to me the worst kind of politics. 315 days passed between the royal assent given to that legislation and the dissolution of Parliament, and yet no effort was made to actually implement that particular provision. The second thing that I want to comment on is that clauses 9 and 10 of that particular Act, the Illegal Migration Act 2023, were, as we've been hearing, unworkable. They allow people to arrive and claim asylum in the UK, get support and be put up in a hotel, which, as my honourable friend was just describing, will often be in some of the most dire conditions that somebody can go through after fleeing some of the worst experiences that people can have, be it trauma, famine, war, disease, poverty, the list goes on. Applications weren't processed, and so they were not able to leave their hotel. And the consequence isn't just an expensive asylum backlog, it's people living with significant psychological scarring for a very significant amount of time. Which brings me to my third point, which is I will talk more about this when we reach new clause 26, which is in reference to scientific age assessments. But I really do not know how the Conservative Party can talk about the welfare and protection of children. When we heard from the Children's Commissioner in oral testimony about children who were subject to and vulnerable to organ harvesting, rape, sexual assault, and disappearance into hotels and disappearance into wider society, whereas my honourable friend was just saying, they are likely to continue to be abused and exploited and victimised. So I very much will be making these points when we reach that debate. And then lastly, on this point of France, I do wish the Conservative Party would stop throwing stones at one of our nearest neighbours and most important strategic allies, particularly when we are in such a volatile international climate. I think it's really important that we do properly scrutinise, but that at the same time we do not indulge in the petty politics that defined the last Conservative government, disrupted so many of our international relations and actually made us less secure. Thank you.
Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. It's been a small but perfectly formed debate on the clause 38, which repeals all but 6 of the clauses of the Illegal Migration Act, which, as colleagues on this side of the committee have pointed out, despite the amount of time that lapsed from that Act getting on the statute, the vast majority of it has never been commenced. In fact, we had to commence one tiny bit of it so we could restart asylum processing. That's probably the most of it that ever had any effect. Let's be clear, it meant thousands of asylum claims were put on hold, the Illegal Migration Act, because of the duty to remove. Increasing the backlog, putting incredible pressure on the asylum accommodation system, creating what's been called the perma backlog, and we all know what that was and how big it was when we came into government. The Act is largely uncommenced, and it's not going to be under this government's policy. We need to sort out the chaos created by the unworkable and contradictory provisions in the Act. And I suspect, actually, despite the bravado of the Honourable Member for Stockton West and his contribution earlier, that most Conservative ministers knew that this Act was unworkable because it wasn't commenced when they had the ministerial capacity and power to do so for all that time between when it was put on the statute book and when we had a new government a year later. So the system had been left in chaos. But if the government were to accept new clause 2 and simply repeal the entire Act as a whole, it would lead to a missed opportunity to improve aspects of our immigration system. I'm going to go through some of that with the honourable gentleman. But on the duty, what clause 38 does is it removes section 2, which is the duty to remove. The government's committed to ending the migration economic partnership with Rwanda, so section 2 is repealed to deliver this by repealing the duty to remove and associated provisions. Sections 22 to 28 of the Act, we're not retaining the modern slavery provisions, the vast majority of them, from the Illegal Migration Act because they're connected to the duty to remove irregular migrants. These sections were never commenced, provided that where a duty to remove was applied for an individual, that individual should be disqualified from the national referral mechanism unless certain limited exemptions applied. We're removing section 30 to 37, which relate to permanent bans on entry, settlement and citizenship, which, while held up as a success by others, were unenforced and unworkable. Sections 57 and 58 of the Act also repealed. They relate to age assessments, but both sections are unworkable and irrelevant without the duty to remove. So the honourable gentleman shouldn't go away from the debate today thinking we're not interested in scientific age assessments. That isn't true. But the illegal migration scientific age assessment provisions were related to the duty to remove, which has been repealed. Therefore, we can come back to talking about using that kind of technology. I'll give way in a second. But not in the context of this Act.
Is there any reason we couldn't be bringing it forward as part of this Act, or is there a time limit when we can expect to, when will we expect to see any provisions in that place?
Well, there's work going on in the department to assess the accuracy of the various methods of age assessment, which he and his his predecessor ministers sort of commenced, hasn't been finished yet. So as soon as we've got Mr. Stewart more idea about how reliable scientific age assessment can be and how expensive and all of those things, I'll be coming to either Parliament or making a statement about how we intend to proceed. So he mustn't assume that because these clauses have been repealed that we're not interested in scientific age assessments and the potential of it per se. Simply that they were unworkable because they were attached to the duty to remove, which was such a feature of this Act. The 6 measures which the government intends to retain, including where provisions are enforced, have been identified as having operational utility and benefit. These powers are all ones which this government sees as important tools to allow for the proper operation of the immigration system and to achieve wider priorities alongside powerful measures set out in this bill. Now, the honourable gentleman talked about section 29, the public order disqualification under the Nationality and Borders Act, is currently in operation. It enables decisions to disqualify certain individuals from support and protections afforded by the national referral mechanisms on grounds of public order and bad faith. Disqualification on public order grounds includes serious criminality and threats to national security. These decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, considering the individual's vulnerabilities. And that is the sole modern slavery measure in the Illegal Migration Act, which is being retained. It would, if commenced in a minute, amend the public order disqualification to allow more foreign national offenders to be considered for disqualification from modern slavery protections on public order grounds. Disqualification will continue to be assessed on an individual basis. I give way.
People should got to that particular last sentence here because it's quite clear in section 29. They only have victims of modern slavery only have to be considered a threat to public order to qualify for the status of the issues of this. But I'd just like to ask her, it's quite likely that many victims of modern slavery is going to get caught up in this. In fact, they already have. And is she happy and satisfied that those that were probably coerced into criminal activity will now almost be blanket banned for any opportunity to go through the asylum process in the United Kingdom?
Mr. Stewart, there won't be a blanket ban. Let me just give the honourable gentleman a view on what that those individuals have been subject to public order disqualification currently for things like multiple drug offences, offences for possessing a firearm and ammunition, multiple counts of sexual assault and assault by beating, grooming, engaging in sexual communication with a child. These are the kind of things that lead to public order disqualifications currently. Nothing in the retention of Section 29 will mean that individual circumstances on a case-by-case basis cannot be taken into account. And it's important to understand that that will still happen. Section 29, if it were commenced, and it isn't commenced yet, would introduce a duty to apply the public order disqualification unless there are compelling circumstances that the disqualification should not apply. So that still ensures case-by-case consideration. On the citizenship ban, that is removed from the bill because it was unworkable and unenforced, again attached to the duties to remove. So we have updated the good character guidance to prevent people from gaining citizenship if they arrive illegally by dangerous journeys. The idea of that is to emphasise that citizenship is not a right, it's a privilege, and we will continue to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. I think that the other clauses that we've retained are again thought to be useful. The 6 measures, Section 12, again emphasises the right of the Secretary of State to determine what constitutes a reasonable time period to detain a person for the specific statutory purpose of effecting removal from the UK. Section 52 allows flexibility in our judiciary by making first-tier tribunal judges eligible to sit in the upper-tier tribunal. I can't imagine anyone in the committee would worry about that. Section 59, if commenced, extends the inadmissibility provisions to asylum and human rights claims from nationals in a list of generally safe states. Section 60 requires an annual cap to be set on the number of individuals admitted to the UK via safe and legal routes, and Section 62 adds failing to provide information such as a passcode to an electronic device to the behaviours which could be considered damaging to the credibility of an asylum and human rights claim. All of those issues are thought to be provide utility, but out of the context of the duty to remove.
The question is that Clause 38 stand part of the bill. As many are of that opinion, say aye.
Aye.
And on the contrary, no.
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 Aye. Division. Lock the doors.
Sarah Bull.
No.
Jay Cotterill.
Aye.
Dame Angela Regal.
Aye.
Becky Gittins.
Aye.
Tom Hayes.
Aye.
Katie Lamb.
No.
Martin McCluskey.
Aye.
Margaret Millay.
Aye.
Chris Murray.
Aye.
Kenneth Stevenson.
Aye.
Mike Tapp.
Aye.
Matt Vickers.
No.
Joe White.
Aye.
Pete Wishart.
No.
The ayes were 10, the noes were 4, and the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Beg to move that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned.
The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Committee Room 9, sound. 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 Committee Room